following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be and whatever time it may be as you're listening to this program. Welcome. Welcome to another edition of Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And my name is Claire Hall. I'm your host, and if you've been listening for a while, you know that we have a wide range of guests on this program, but one of my recurring favorite themes is baseball books, although our guest tonight not only is author of two great baseball biographies, he is also author of a great new football biography. So we'll be talking about all of his works and who knows what else in the program. Our guest is Joe Niese. And Joe, welcome and thank you for taking the time to be on Ask Claire.
Thanks, Claire. I appreciate it. Great to speak with you.
Okay, before we get into your career as well, I remember seeing on Facebook that one newspaper described you as a prolific sports biographer, and I guess with 3 of these books under your belt already and more in the works, I think you've earned that title. But, unfortunately for most folks, unless I guess you're Stephen King, writing books doesn't pay the bills. So you have a day job, and, just tell us about your day job and anything else about yourself that you might like to share.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm a public library director. I've been a director for the past 5 years in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. I've been working in libraries for about 15 years. After I graduated college with a psychology degree, I didn't really know what to do, and so I had a friend who was teaching down in Gallup, New Mexico in the Four Corners, and he invited me down there, and I taught 6th grade for a year, and my hat is off to teachers. What a job they have. So when I saw that wasn't the direction I wanted to go with my career, I moved back home to western Wisconsin and started working in a library, just shelving books, and 15 years later, I'm the director of the library.
Well, that's great. That's great. And where did your interest in writing sports biographies come from? How did that get started?
Well, I was always very interested in sports. Played baseball up until my mid-20s, but I was always, I wasn't that great a student academically, but I loved reading, and in particular sports biographies I just devoured. And so when I kind of ended playing sports, I kind of turned to writing about it. And I was just going to write some articles for local magazines and newspapers, and stuff just kind of snowballed from there.
So your first book, correct, was about Burleigh Grimes, who is probably best remembered if you quizzed a baseball fan and said, give a one-sentence description of Mr. Grimes, baseball's last legal spitballer. So how did he become your first subject for a book-length biography?
Well, I haven't ventured very far. All 3 of my subjects have been from western Wisconsin, and I think I've kind of exhausted the big names here. So I was going to do just maybe a 5,000-word article on Grimes. For some, I really didn't know where I was going to put this, but so the more I looked into it, he's from Clear Lake, Wisconsin, which is about an hour from me. I'm in Chippewa Falls, grew up in Eau Claire, city nearby here. The larger of the 2 cities is Eau Claire, but anyway, so, I was just going to do this larger article. I traveled to Clear Lake. There's a museum there dedicated to Clear Lake history. Their 2 big rooms are to Grimes and Gaylord Nelson, the other big name from the little town there. And so
the Wisconsin U.S. Senator. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Correct, yeah. Founding up Earth Day, created Earth Day. And I'd have to give the nod to Gaylord on the larger impact on humanity than Grimes. So I traveled there, and I met with kind of the guy who was the son that Grimes never had, a guy by the name of Charles Clark. He's in his 80s now. and is kind of the keeper of all things Grimes. He's just an amazing man with amazing stories about traveling to Cooperstown every year with Grimes and meeting all these people, and he could have a book written about himself.
Neat. So, for folks who aren't familiar with Mr. Grimes, a Hall of Fame pitcher, certainly the last legal spitballer, but much more, maybe just tell us about a little bit about his life and career and, what you learned about him, what your biggest takeaways would be about Burleigh Grimes.
Sure. A competitor, I guess that's an understatement. He played for 7 different teams, a rarity at that time. He played from 1916 to 1934 and was very well traveled. Played mostly in the National League except for a few months with the Yankees in I think 33 or 34 towards the end of his career. But quite the competitor. Didn't get along with many people. He fought with everyone, from opponents to umpires to his own teammates. By the time he had kind of worn out his welcome in Brooklyn, he wasn't talking to his manager. He'd have some guy from the streets warming him up. And so didn't get along with people very well, but was a gamer and was obviously wanted by people and then not wanted by people. And so, played in 4 different World Series with a couple different teams. I have 3 different teams with it that he played in the World Series with.
Right.
First player to do that. And so, long career in baseball, started in the teens and lasted up through the early 70s. His last job was as a scout with the Orioles and kind of groomed those pitching staffs of the late 60s, early 70s.
So, yes, a long and fascinating career in baseball, and I think the fact that, he was such a gruff and abrasive personality, that seems like, in your next subject, outfielder Andy Pafko, you found perhaps personality-wise, would you say almost Grimes' polar opposite, a guy who comes across as really beloved, well-liked, and well-remembered by everybody?
That's perfect, Claire. That's kind of when I do my talks. I kind of say I go from one end of the likability scale to the other, with from Grimes to Pafko. Another guy from Western Wisconsin, a farm boy, just like Grimes was. They grew up, just maybe 15 miles apart. Different times, obviously, but Pafko was friends with Mr. Clark as well. And when I was done with the book on Burleigh, he kind of, nudged me a little bit, say, it might be worth to take a look at Andy's story. And so I did, and once again found some great resources and people. I reached out, and his nephew, Frank Pafko, was kind of the key person there. But there's people in Boyceville, where Andy was from, that were instrumental with that as well.
Yeah, and maybe talk a little bit more, please, about his life, his career, and certainly, even though he didn't quite rise to the caliber of a Hall of Famer, he was somebody who was in the game as a player for a long, long time, and on several winning teams. Although I guess his stay in Brooklyn was pretty brief, but anyway, I don't want to steal your thunder. So tell us more about Handy Andy Pafko.
Sure, yeah. So he started out with the Cubs, and I guess the most glaring error in my book was I said he was on the Cubs' last World Series team. It was in 45, though. So I guess since
but that was true at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So but he was on the Cubs up until 51 when he was traded to Brooklyn mid-season, and his probably most famous from his time in Brooklyn was he was in left field as Bobby Thompson's shot heard around the world went over his head, helplessly looking up into the stands. A famous picture of Andy doing that as the ball flew into the Polo Grounds stands in left field.
Yep.
And his time from Brooklyn, another thing was his 52 Topps card, which is one of the most sought after cards around, a mint condition card, I guess that is. You know, in short, it was the first card in the series. You know, it was Topps kind of their first modern venture into baseball cards, and he was the number one card in the series. And of course, cards weren't the commodity then that they became in the 70s and 80s, and so, you know, kids are rubber banding them and all that stuff, and so it's difficult to find a mint condition Andy Pafko 52 Topps card.
And the reason being that, yeah, and you mentioned with rubber banding, the reason being if anybody didn't rubber band baseball cards, and I'm sad to say I did as a preteen as well, and I'm, bet that the number one card, of course, would take the card at the top of the pile, and since Pafko was first in the series, would really take, I guess, the greatest wear from the rubber band, but then, he on to Milwaukee, and I know the trade, you have some insights or thoughts on it, but the rather abrupt trade of Pafko from Brooklyn to Milwaukee still, seems to baffle a lot of fans all these decades later.
Yeah, I don't think he ever really got a clear answer. I couldn't unearth one when I was looking for it. I don't know if they were just just looking to cut ties with him, that he never, he had a decent 52 season, but I don't think he was never the same player he was in Chicago, that's for sure.
That's true, but, I've seen so many Brooklyn Dodger fans, and I believe you're a member of the Brooklyn Dodger pages I administer on Facebook, correct?
Yeah.
That they'll talk about how, Furillo, Snyder, and, of course, that great infield, it was a team that was absolutely solid at every position except for left field, which seemed to be kind of a revolving door, and all the fans who remember, that trade really thought he was going to be the Brooklyn left fielder for years to come, but for whatever reason, it didn't happen. But, then Pafko went on to another, a very long and happy stay in Milwaukee, and just some reflections, if you would, please, Joe, on his Milwaukee years.
Sure, Claire, yeah. So it was a homecoming for him. Wisconsin was a Cubs state up until that point. Mm-hmm. So they had a huge Cubs following, and then when the Braves decided to move there in spring training at 53, it was a perfect opportunity. Andy, despite playing with Hall of Famers like Eddie Matthews, Henry Aaron, Warren Spahn, Andy was consistently the most popular player on the team. And he was the only home state guy, and large Slovak population as well, and Milwaukee didn't hurt either. And so, Andy really enjoyed it, the end of his career there, and helped them win the 57 World Series, even though he had a few down years, but injuries got him back in the lineup. Other people's injuries got him back in the lineup in 57, helped them to the title that year, and played quite a bit in 58, though they lost to the Yankees that year.
Yeah, it a very enjoyable book, and, a player whose career I knew, kind of in the broad brush outlines, but thanks to your biography, Handy Andy, I really feel like I got to know him very well, and, not only as a ball player, but really as a person with, really good, solid values, fine character, and you can kind of understand why everybody in baseball loved him. Kind of the anti-Grimes, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, I think you're right there.
Yeah, so let's move on, as you already mentioned, to your most recent book, and you stay, as you indicated, you stayed in western Wisconsin, but made a foray this time into football biography with Gus Dorias. And I've got to admit, I enjoy football, but not to the same extent as baseball. But Dorias was a name that I did know, certainly for his association with Knute Rockne at Notre Dame. But, maybe tell us what led you to Dorias as a subject, and give us the sketch of his, really long and interesting lifetime in football, please.
Sure, Claire, yeah. And so it's kind of an interesting time to be writing about football. I first and foremost, I'm a baseball guy, but I played football in high school and had a wonderful experience playing football, and I played a couple games at Burleigh Field here in Chippewa Falls. But kind of the climate with football now, it's an interesting thing to write about. But Dorias is one of those names that is forgotten, but is such a big part of football history. So he is kind of the person that popularized, or one of the main people who popularized the forward pass in the early 1900s. He was throwing the ball. Forward pass wasn't legalized until 1906. And he was throwing the ball even then in high school. And by the time he got to Notre Dame and teamed up with his roommate, receiver, and good friend, Rockney, they really kind of set the standard for forward passes at the college level, highlighted by a game against Army in 1913 where they really beat Army handily using the forward pass. And so, that's kind of what he's known for, but there's so, reading the book, as you read the book, there's quite more to his story than that. And so it was enjoyable to tell his story, and it was my first time collaborating with someone. I worked with his grandson, Bob, on it, and that was just a wonderful experience.
Yeah, and Bob, from what I understand from your introduction and his, that he had been collecting material about his grandfather with the intent of doing a biography someday. So it seems like, your collaboration gave some added depth to the portrait of Dorias, off the field especially, I imagine, and the kind of things that would only be passed down through a family in terms of, family history and lore.
You're exactly right. Bob had been working on it for a couple decades, dating back to the 80s and 90s, and hadn't worked on it that much in recent years. And then I just found his name in an old Ancestry.com message board from the 90s, and I just reached out to the email on there, and I had no idea that he'd been working on a book, and he kind of gave me his blessing. He gave me a lot of his information. I would say most of the writing is mine in the book, without his proofreading and adding in those little stories, the book wouldn't be what it is without him.
Well, that's great, and it was just really interesting to me to see. I mean, how, like, say, there he is as a young, just barely out of Notre Dame graduate, coaching high school football, and yet playing in professional football on the weekends. Certainly, the NFL wasn't anything like it's become today, but seeing his evolution from that to a college coach, and then finally toward the end of his career, his very last stop as a coach with the Detroit Lions of the NFL. But really, even though the football of 60 years ago, he passed away in 1954, the game is, quite different. But I was thinking, from his time at Notre Dame till his passing, what enormous change, he saw in the game and was part of in the game, and any further reflections on that?
Well, you said it perfectly, Claire. Yeah, just from that evolution of when he, his first day on campus at Notre Dame till his death in '54, so much happened. And even at his time in Notre Dame, all these rule changes that loosened up the passing game, and then, kind of that famed Notre Dame offense started when they were in college, and when after Rockney passed away in 30, or was it 31?
I believe 31.
31. Dorias became a little more open about things and wrote this book that was kind of considered the Bible on passing offense and defense against the passing game. And so, he was just really a huge part of that, the evolution of football and the passing game in particular. It was also fun to, go ahead, Claire.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, please, Joe.
One of my favorite parts is the names you come across, like Arch Ward. You know, he befriended Arch Ward when he was in high school in Dubuque, or Bing Crosby out at Gonzaga, and so you know, that's one of the fun little parts, is coming across these names that are, you know, everyone knows that was a part of his life.
Yeah, and what about one name I was going to ask you about was the name of John Stockton. By any chance, it was the NBA guard, a descendant of the John Stockton who finds his way into your pages?
Yes, yeah, that's his grandfather. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's what I would have assumed. You know, in small world, a couple of friends and I were watching the NBA All-Star game many years ago with another friend of ours who really wasn't much of a sports fan, but just wanted to hang out with us for the afternoon. And the sportscaster is talking about West All-Star guard John Stockton, and all of a sudden our friend perked up and said, "Hey, I went to high school with a guy named John Stockton." And my friend Tim and I both looked at her and said, "At Gonzaga by any chance?" And she nodded, and we both pointed up at the screen and said, "Yep, that's him."
Oh, that's funny.
So, yeah, a very enjoyable book. And I was thinking, too, as you mentioned, that famous Army game where Doré and Rockne really teamed up to showcase, what a potent weapon the forward pass could be. And I was thinking of, the Hollywood film about Rockne's life, and a couple of guys standing on the sidelines, and one of them exclaims, "This'll revolutionize football." And, maybe that happened, maybe that didn't, but, it really was one of the true milestones in the history of the evolution of the game.
Yes, yeah. I think that film could probably be watched by Mystery Science Theater, and get some laughs out of it, but
yeah, a little schmaltzy, a little corny, but at the same time, I've got to admit, every time I watch it, I also get a little choked up too, and Pat O'Brien, and I'm sure I tell friends, you got to watch our films of Rockne out there, and I think, I get the sense that Pat O'Brien really captured something there, and anyway, let's get back to you and your projects. And how about, you're headed back to baseball, correct, with another former Brooklyn Dodger, Zach Wheat?
Yeah, I'm kind of juggling two projects right now. Zach Wheat, I kind of do it in the season, or when the mood strikes there, but I'd say about halfway done with Zach Wheat's biography right now. What a player he was, and just how few people know who he is. And so
please, for the people who are listening who don't, especially those who don't know Zach Wheat, give us kind of the capsule story of this man.
Sure. And so he was a longtime member of, we'll just call them the Brooklyn Dodgers. They had so many names at that time. I think a lot in my Grimes book, I refer to them a lot as the Robins, but I just saw something, it might have been on the Dodgers page, someone had put on there the frequency of what the nickname they were called at the time. Do you remember this post?
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember. And
yeah, I don't remember the exact details, but they did go through so many, they were Robins for so many years, but it really didn't become initial. I think it's interesting that, baseball nicknames were much more fluid, that Dodgers wasn't officially adopted by the club until after the 1932 season.
Yeah, yep. And of course
that even, I've come across this in my own reading and research on the Dodgers. I don't know if you've seen that, even in 1926, I believe, when Wilbert Robinson was still their manager and still most newspapers were calling them the Robins, that the sports editor of the New York Sun and Robinson got into a terrible dispute, and the editor at that point decreed Robinson's name would never appear in the Sun again, and from now on the team would be known in their pages as the Dodgers once more. So but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to divert you from Zach Wheat. A Hall of Fame player, and I agree with you, absolutely forgotten and should not be forgotten.
And
tell us more about him, please.
Sure, yeah. So he 1909 was his first season with Brooklyn. Very quiet guy. Was a captain for a number of years, but was definitely overshadowed by other players in the city. Big name players, and especially once Ruth came on the scene, of course. But Frisch overshadowed him, and but excellent left fielder. Was fast. Was a left-handed hitter, right-handed thrower. Hall of Famer. Still holds a number of Dodger hitting records, batting marks. And just one of those guys that has slipped through the cracks over time, and people don't know who he is for the most part, and it's always fun to be able to tell their story, and you start doing this, and you're like, why has something not been written about this guy? And so I'm going through that right now with Zach's story.
Well, good, and I'm certainly going to be in line to read and review it as whenever it does see print. But you said that's not the only project you've got in the works right now?
Yeah, I've kind of been obsessing over Don Hudson of late, the famous Packers wide receiver, or end, as they were known then. He is kind of the Babe Ruth of 1930s, 1940s football. Just put up these ridiculous numbers that dwarfed the people that were behind him, and there's never been a biography written about him.
And that's puzzling. I don't know. Certainly the Green Bay Packers of the Lombardi era are legendary, but the Pack has a long and glorious NFL history, and certainly he was one of the, if not the greatest, one of the greats of the earlier era. And so what are you discovering about him as you begin to delve a little deeper into his life?
Well, most people consider him the greatest Packer of all time. I think Peter King put him as like the greatest NFL player of all time. This was in the late 90s.
Wow.
He did this, and the 75th anniversary, that stuff was going on, and so the Packers they benefited from Curly Lambeau's affiliation to Notre Dame. He went there for a year. And instead of going back his sophomore year, he'd gotten sick, and so he stayed home and started working in a factory and started the Packers, kind of went from there. And so just very interesting going through articles. I'm in the middle of going through the Chicago Tribune coverage of him right now, which is nice with Chicago's proximity to Green Bay and that rivalry. There's a lot written there. I still have to go through the Green Bay Press Gazette, which is the main source there. But man, the numbers he put up and what he did on the field is pretty crazy. So not much written. There's stuff written about those early Packer years, but I've found kind of through reading from the team's official historian, a lot of that stuff is erroneous. Art Ward actually wrote a book, a Packer history book in the 40s. Got some stuff wrong. That stuff continues to get passed down, and so it'll be interesting kind of fleshing that stuff out. And so I'm working with there's a local a sports radio guy here that I'm going to be working with a little bit on the project, who huge football history buff. I thought I knew a lot going into writing my baseball books, but once you start researching, you realize how little you know, and I found that with football as well.
Well, interesting. So looks like you've got a couple of subjects there to keep you busy for a while to come. So, Joe,
I
as
do.
we kind of wind the program down, with 3 books, out there in the universe, and, talk about the aspect then of what kind of reception you've received from readers, feedback, and just, once a book is out, how you've promoted it and what that experience has been like.
Yeah, well, I've been very fortunate to have very positive feedback. You've been a very good backer of my work, Claire, which I really appreciate. I kind of tirelessly promote it, and I hope I don't fill people's Facebook feeds too much with my stuff. But I do a lot of talks. I'm not afraid to reach out to libraries and gauge their interest. I've probably my first book came out in 2013. And so I've done 3 books in 5 years have come out. And so I've probably done 50, 60 talks on those books. Always willing to, spend all this time working on a book, why not get out there and promote it and talk about it and be comfortable talking about it and be proud of your work and be proud of your work. And, it's a fun thing to do. So.
Well, I know you purchased my book about Oregon Governor Tom McCall, and I would agree that, I probably did maybe 24 talks, and, it's really neat being able to connect with your readers. And I don't know, have you ever had this experience? I met several people who had known Governor McCall, and there were a couple who came up with great stories about him that I just said, well, gee, that's a wonderful story. I wish I would have known it before I finished the book so I could have worked it in. You ever have somebody come forward with a Grimes story you hadn't discovered in your research and say, gee, I wish I had known that sooner?
I think every time I go to visit Chuck Clark, he has a different story for me that could have gone in the book. So that's one of the most painful things is to come across something that would have been perfect in your book. So.
Well, I'm hoping that I'll have an opportunity sometime to write about McCall again. Probably not another book, but maybe an article or something. So I hope you'll find outlets for the nuggets that you discover along the way as well. But Joe, it's really been a pleasure talking with you, getting to know you better, getting to know your subjects better, and wish you and yours all the very best as we roll into this holiday season.
Likewise, Claire, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I'd be happy to do it again. We don't need to talk about sports books, although that's how we know each other, but I'd be happy to talk about other stuff too sometime.
That'd be fun. Okay, it'll be a return date. So thank you, Joe, and thank you all for listening to Ask Claire. Until we meet up again, keep smiling.